I came across a problem yesterday. Just like most of my problems, this one came up while I was translating Dream of the Red Chamber into English. I'm doing this for my blog, and it's a slow and somewhat painful process. Anyway, I just got through the rough part of the book. That would be a series of 13 cryptic poems in Chapter 5 that predict the lives and ultimate downfalls of most of the major female characters in the novel. The poems are hard to understand. This is in part because many of them talk about characters that we haven't met yet, and in part because they are designed to be cryptic. Anyway, the main character, Jia Baoyu, is reading these poems while he's sitting in some sort of heavenly library, I guess. The goddess who unveils illusion is near him, watching him read. He wants to keep reading, but she closes his book and tells him that he should walk around with her instead. Now, that sentence, the one where she tells him to walk with her, is the one that gave me trouble. In particular, it was this word here, qie. Okay, I should warn you beforehand that I'm not interested in just getting like a general idea of what the original text says. I'm much more interested in knowing exactly how everything works, and if there's a grammatical thing that I don't understand, I want to know what's going on. We'll just look at this phrase here, 且随我去游玩奇境. If we get rid of 且, it still makes perfect sense. She says something like, come walk with me around and look at all the amazing sights. That alone tells us that the 且 here is doing something, right? It's probably acting as some sort of adverb or some kind of grammatical particle. Now, I know from my years of learning Chinese that 且 is often used to mean something like and. This comes up in words like 而且, which is a really common conjunction in modern Chinese. But that doesn't make sense here. She wouldn't say and in this context. And so what do? Well, we look it up. Well, it turns out the Wiktionary has no fewer than 13 different definitions for 且. The one I think is correct in this context is number 4, where it says just or for the time being. So if we go back to that sentence, it makes some sense. She tells him that we should take a break from the book and go walk around a little bit instead for now, for the time being. Let's put it down for now, you can pick it up later. But that brings us to a conundrum, which is kind of the purpose of this video. Sure, we can look it up when we come across something a little bit crazy like that, but how can we learn it? In other words, what should I do to make sure that I remember that the word 且 occasionally has this kind of meaning? Well, I'll show you what I've done to teach myself tricky grammatical concepts like this one. Okay, first of all, I'm assuming that you're familiar with at least some kind of spaced repetition software. When I'm talking about that software, I'm talking about programs like Anki, which is the one that I use. If you're a language student and you aren't using one of these programs, now's the day to start. Stop using homemade flashcards and start creating electronic cards that keep track of your progress for you. But that's the problem. You shouldn't make a flashcard that has 13 different definitions for one word. Trust me, I've tried. It doesn't work. You see, a few years ago I would have made a card with a ton of definitions and would have been on my way. But then I read this old article on effectively formulating knowledge from the SuperMemo website. So SuperMemo is an old flashcard program. It's not quite as powerful as Anki, but it does get the job done. Anyway, there's good stuff here, obviously. You should understand something before you try to learn it, for example. You should learn it first before you stick the cards in to memorize them. But this part right here is key, the minimum information principle. Now, there are a lot of words here. I'm not going to go over them. Let me just sum them up for you. Our brains might be capable of learning complex things, but it's a lot easier for us to learn and remember things that are simple. And if we simplify complex things, it becomes easier for us to put the pieces together to build a complex puzzle in our brains. For instance, back when I was in high school, for some reason I memorized each US president in order. My secret was to memorize the victorious political parties first and go backwards from what I already knew. So for example, I knew that Ronald Reagan was a Republican. It was then easier to remember that his predecessor was a Democrat, that was Jimmy Carter. And then it was easy to remember that his predecessor was a Republican, President Ford, and that President Ford took over after Nixon resigned. Before that, we had a Democrat, Lyndon B. Johnson, and he took over after President Kennedy was assassinated. And before that was President Eisenhower, a Republican. So you see, by simply remembering the party patterns and a few of those special exceptions, people resigning or being shot, I could easily go back decades without really straining my mind to remember who was who and in what order they came. And this isn't just the way that my mind works. Your mind works the same way. Things that are really complex, for example, really strange definitions of grammatical particles in classical Chinese, those are a lot easier if you can break them down into easy to remember concepts. And there's one more thing that you need here, that's context. And so I came up with an idea for attacking this grammar issue. Instead of creating a card with che on one side and 13 definitions on the back, I decided to start learning grammar through the context of the language. Now, I do want to clarify this. There are some people who think that you need to have the target language on both sides of your card. I would argue against that. At least it's never helped me in the dozen or so languages that I've learned. I would say that you really want to make sure that you understand things as much as you can, and you want to keep the process really simple. The last thing that you want to do is come to the definition of a word and not know what it says. No, what I mean when I say learning through context, I'm talking about something that's a little bit different. What I mean is that you need to learn grammar through sentences. So Wiktionary has a great sample sentence right here from the Shiji, 民劳未可且待之. It means our civilians are exhausted, so we can't attack. For now, let's wait here. Now, you can look at the greater historical context if you really want, but it doesn't matter for us. Remember, all we care about right now is the grammatical function of che. You can see here that che must be some kind of adverbial. If you get rid of it, the sentence makes sense, though it's a bit more direct. That's how you can tell that it's got that softening effect. So what do we do with this sentence? We make an Anki card with it. I created a template that works pretty well. On one side I have my sentence, I put the grammatical particle that I want to learn in bold, and I also put the definition of the sentence down in English. I do this because I only want to test myself on one thing with each card. I have separate sentence cards where I instruct myself to read the sentence aloud or to listen to the sentence read and reply with what it means, stuff like that. You only want a single card in Anki or whatever program you use to test you on one thing. Remember, simplicity is the key. The only thing I'm asking myself here is what the grammatical function of this part in bold is. In fact, I'll let myself cheat by reading the English definition of the sentence if I really want to. The reason why is because the purpose here is to plant somewhere in my brain that che has this very specific meaning, and the easiest way to teach myself that is by repeatedly showing myself that specific meaning. And now, if you want to learn how to tell this version of che apart from the others, you can. Just make cards for the other meanings. Alright, so check out this sentence. 他的演讲简短且切中要害. It means his speech was short and to the point. I wish I spoke like that. Anyway, you can see that che here has a different grammatical function. So again, make a card for this function. Maybe the sentence is easy, but just make the card anyway. That way you can remember in the long term that che can also mean something like and. Or here's another old one. 且构建为人能辛苦 进不灭后不悔之. It means, furthermore, King Gojian's conduct has always been one of endurance during extreme hardship. If you fail to neutralize him at this moment, you will regret it later. But of course, all we care about here is that che in this context means furthermore. So if you compare the first clause of that sentence with our example from Dream of the Red Chamber, you'll notice that che is in the same initial position both times, and yet it has two very different meanings. And honestly, that's why you've got to go through this exercise. That sort of thing happens with these languages. Sometimes it makes sense and it's easy, other times it's pretty hard and you've got to learn multiple definitions of a single word. But of course, things are always easier in context. As fun as this trick is to do with Chinese, I've learned that it's actually even more effective with other languages. So take Korean, for example. Korean has a bunch of particles that do all sorts of things and it's hard to keep them straight. Well, I came across this sentence at some point in time. 기차가 지나가기에 손을 흔들었다. It means I waved at the train going by. But the hard part about this sentence is the phrasing. 기차가 지나가기 comes from the phrase 기차가 지나가다, which means the train goes by. 기 here works as a nominalizing particle. It takes that phrase and turns it into a noun. And so the thing that I'm waving at is that phrase. The a particle here indicates that I'm waving at that phrase, that thing. Now this is pretty complex since we're talking about taking a sentence and turning it into an embedded nominal phrase. However, if you learn that ki has the ability to nominalize like this, it becomes a lot easier to understand. And so I just learned that part. If you look up key on Wiktionary, by the way, you'll not only be overwhelmed by definitions, but you'll eventually realize that this particular grammatical function is not even listed there. Anyway, that's why you've got to spend at least some time with the grammar books. It might not necessarily help you that much with something like classical Chinese, where the grammar is really closely connected with individual words. However, in languages with different particles, Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, and pretty much every European language when you really think about it, it comes in handy to have a really good grammatical book. And so what I did is I got a copy of Korean, A Comprehensive Grammar, published by Routledge. I went through the book and mined it for sentences, especially sentences that showed certain grammatical patterns. And after learning those sentences, I stuck them in Anki and have been using them to review. The thing is that you can do this with any sort of language, and in fact, you don't need to use my specific template for it to work. What you need to understand are the basic principles. Remember that you need to understand what you're learning before you can learn it. Don't just stick random stuff into Anki and expect it to work like magic. You also need to actually learn it before you can memorize it, otherwise it will just be a bunch of nonsense in your mind. And then comes the big part: you need to simplify things as much as possible. Make it so that it's easy and fast for you to go through your Anki cards every day. Well, that's the secret to picking up and retaining grammar, even if you can't be fully immersed in the language. And that's the problem with languages like classical Chinese. Even if you live in China and spend all of your time talking with professors, you still won't actually be immersed into a classical Chinese linguistic environment. The best thing you can do is to try to simplify things for your own mind and learn the language in its own context as best as you can. Anyway, the cool thing here is that it does work. In fact, this works for any language that you might want to learn, just as long as you follow those basic principles and make sure to keep things simple for yourself. Remember, the more that you expose your brain to these new concepts, the more that these things will stick with you in the long run.